The party was packed, the kind of event where exaggerated laughter and sly glances filled every corner. The atmosphere seemed perfect for those who didn't know what really happened behind the glass doors. I knew. My presence there was neither a coincidence nor a slip-up. Every step I took in that room was carefully calculated, every word that came out of my mouth had a purpose. The letter in my pocket burned like a final sentence, and with every second that passed, I felt the weight of everything that was about to fall apart. I found her near the center table, laughing at something he had said. He, her boss, had that air of superiority that made me feel nauseous. His gaze occasionally fell on her in a way that left no doubt. My blood was boiling, but I maintained my composure. I had to maintain it. I had promised myself I wouldn't make a scene. If you step out of line, I'll end everything, that's what I said last time. But she thought it was just an empty threat. She saw me. Her eyes widened, a mixture of shock and guilt. I approached slowly, like a predator spotting its prey. Each step seemed to echo through the room, although the music was still loud and laughter still filled the space. When I finally came face to face with her, I didn't wait for explanations. I handed over the letter. "Read it," was all I said. His fingers trembled as he opened the envelope. The smile she had maintained until then disappeared, giving way to an expression of despair that she tried to hide. That was the moment I had been waiting for, but at the same time, an emptiness began to grow inside me. Part of me wanted her to deny everything, for there to be some absurd explanation that somehow made sense. But there wasn't. "Please, not here," she whispered, her eyes begging for a privacy she herself had destroyed. "Now you care about discretion?" My voice was low, but full of sarcasm. "You never thought about that when you were with him." She tried to speak, but the words seemed stuck. And then, as if reality had finally dawned on her, tears began to flow. People around started to notice, but I didn't care. I had spent too many nights alone, lost in thoughts and assumptions. I had ignored signs, deceived myself, and now, there she was, in front of me, without any masks left. He walked closer, trying to look confident, but I noticed the hesitation in his movements. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, forcing a casual tone that was as fake as his smile. "Why don't you ask her?" I replied, looking at him with a coldness that hid the storm inside me. He didn't respond, but the discomfort on his face was evident. The scene was as absurd as it was devastating. I saw myself there, in a crowded hall, being mentally applauded for my courage as my life publicly fell apart. There was nothing she could say that would fix this, and I knew it. But what really made me question everything was realizing that, even when faced with the obvious, she was still hesitant to admit it. "It was just once," she finally said, her voice so faint I almost didn't believe I heard it. "Bullshit," I replied immediately, without hesitation. "And you know it." Her eyes searched mine, but there was no longer the warmth there was before, just a desperate attempt to prevent everything from ending there. "I love you," she said, but those words had never sounded so empty. "Love isn't like that," I replied, pain mixed with anger taking over. "If you loved me, this would never have happened." For a moment, time seemed to stop. I wondered at what moment everything had started to fall apart. Would it be my fault? Was it something I did or didn't do? But then I looked at her again, at him, and realized it didn't matter anymore. The choices she made were clear, and the consequences were inevitable. "You don't understand," she began, but I interrupted her. "No, you don't understand," my voice was louder now. "I built all of this for us. I trusted you, I believed in you, and you destroyed it all." She opened her mouth to respond, but I had already turned my back. The divorce letter was in his hands, and I knew that from that moment on, there was no going back. But as I left the room, one question lingered in my mind, something that consumed me more than anything else: why? What had driven my wife, the woman I believed I knew better than anyone, to do this? Was it something I missed? Or was there something deeper, something I didn't yet know. The answers were there, buried in the lies, the half-truths, the furtive glances. But I was determined to find out. And when I found out, she would be the one who would face the brunt of the consequences. The game was over for me, but for her, it was just beginning. Welcome to our channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a powerful message. Betrayal destroys lives, relationships, and trust in irreversible ways. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and turns and strong emotions. Now, sit back, take a deep breath and prepare yourself for a shocking story that will keep you hooked until the end. Good story. Mark and Emma were, in everyone's eyes, the perfect couple. He, a dedicated and detail-oriented engineer, known for his ability to solve problems in both his professional and personal life, and she, a charismatic and creative woman, whose smile seemed to light up any room. Their marriage, more than a decade old, was often cited as an example among friends and family. The connection between the two seemed unshakable, the result of years of mutual support, challenges overcome and shared dreams. The house where they lived reflected this union. A cozy and well-kept home, where every detail seemed to have been chosen with care. Photographs of the trips they took together decorated the shelves in the living room, while small notes with messages of love could still be found on the kitchen wall, a habit that Mark and Emma had maintained since the first months of their relationship. For any visitor, that place exuded the tranquility of a life built on solid foundations. Mark has always been a methodical man, the type of person who liked to plan every detail of his day, whether at work or at home. He had an almost unbreakable routine. He would wake up early, go for his morning run around the leafy neighborhood, and then make breakfast for himself and Emma. This ritual was a way to start the day with her, a practice he never left aside, even on the busiest days. There was something comforting about hearing her laugh as they drank coffee, talking about the day's plans or the little news they each had to share. Emma, on the other hand, was spontaneous and a little unpredictable, traits that Mark had always admired. Working as an event planner, she handled tight deadlines and last-minute changes with a lightness that seemed natural. This spontaneity contrasted with Mark's organization, but it was exactly what kept them balanced. She used to say that he was the anchor that kept her steady, while she was the wind that pushed him towards new adventures. This balance made them a formidable duo, both in moments of joy and in difficult times. Despite the apparent harmony, day-to-day responsibilities began to create small cracks. Mark, dedicated to his work, often brought work home, immersing himself in spreadsheets and reports late into the night. Emma, in turn, had a busy schedule with events, meetings and short trips. These frequent commitments meant that quiet nights at home became rare, and candlelit dinners that were once common were replaced by quick messages on the cell phone. In recent months, Emma seemed more distracted. She smiled less at breakfast, responded in monosyllables to Mark's questions, and spent more time on the phone. He noticed the changes, but attributed it to work stress. The end-of-the-year events always leave Emma exhausted, he thought. However, something about her behavior seemed different this time, as if there was a weight she couldn't share. On the other hand, Mark also had his own worries. He had recently been promoted to a more responsible position, which meant more work, more pressure and less time for himself. The promotion was an important milestone in his career, but the cost seemed greater than he expected. He struggled to balance professional demands with his personal life, but felt he was always failing in some area. Guilt followed him like a shadow, especially when he looked at Emma and saw the tiredness in her eyes. Friday nights, which used to be reserved for them, became lonelier. Emma often had professional commitments, while Mark used the time to get ahead on his tasks. The house, once so vibrant and full of life, began to seem quieter. Still, Mark clung to the hope that all this was temporary, just a difficult phase that they would overcome together, like so many other times. One day, Emma arrived home later than usual, carrying bags from a clothing store. Mark was sitting on the sofa, reviewing some documents, but when he saw her come in, he he smiled and asked casually, "Busy day?" She hesitated for a moment before answering, as if organizing the words in her mind. "Yes, but I managed to resolve everything in time," he said, forcing a smile. Mark noticed her hesitation, but decided not to press her. He knew Emma hated being asked about work when she was tired. Later that same night, while Emma was showering, Mark walked by her office and saw something that made him stop. An open diary on the table, with hastily scribbled notes. It wasn't unusual for Emma to leave things lying around, but something caught her eye, a date circled in red, with a name written next to it. He didn't recognize the name, but he shook off the thoughts that arose. It must be something from work, he said to himself, before returning to the room. Although he tried to ignore it, that small detail stayed in his mind. Not because he distrusted Emma, but because it was different from her usual behavior. Emma had always been transparent about her commitments, and the feeling that something was out of place bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The following Saturday, while Mark was on his morning run, he passed by a cafe where they used to go together. He paused for a moment, looking at the tables outside, remembering how they laughed and talked there on lazy Sunday mornings. The coffee was still the same, but something inside it felt different. A restlessness he couldn't explain. When he returned home, he found Emma in the kitchen, preparing pancakes, something he hadn't done in weeks. She smiled when she saw him enter, and for a moment, Mark felt like things were returning to normal. They sat together, laughed, talked about trivial things, and Mark thought maybe he was exaggerating. But at the same time, a part of him knew that the distance that had grown between them wouldn't disappear so easily. Over the next few weeks, Mark tried to rekindle the flame that seemed to be fading. He suggested short trips, movie nights at home and even dance lessons, something Emma had always wanted to do but never found the time. Emma seemed receptive, but Mark noticed that even in moments of fun, she was distant, as if a part of her was somewhere else. The two were trapped in a silent cycle, where unspoken words created ever greater barriers. Mark believed that their love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle, but a doubt began to creep into his thoughts. Was it too late? While he struggled to find answers, Emma carried secrets of her own, which would soon threaten to destroy everything they had built together. Mark felt that the space between him and Emma had become a chasm that was difficult to ignore. Days turned into weeks, and that feeling that something was out of place continued to bother him. He wanted to believe it was just paranoia, the result of tiredness and responsibilities, but small details accumulated, forming an incomplete puzzle that he couldn't decipher. The nights became quieter. Emma seemed to avoid long conversations, as if she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Mark tried to start the conversation several times, but she always deflected with short answers, often changing the topic abruptly. He tried hard not to pressure her, but every evasive gesture she made his doubts grow. One night, while Mark was reviewing a report in his home office, Emma's cell phone vibrated on the living room table. She was upstairs, in the shower. The screen lit up for a few seconds, and Mark saw a message notification. The name was unknown, but the brief preview on the screen made his heart skip a beat. I already missed the last time. He froze. 1,000 thoughts ran through his head. On the one hand, he felt that looking at his cell phone would be a violation of privacy that he could never justify. On the other hand, the message seemed to confirm all his suspicions. After a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, he decided to leave his cell phone where it was. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but that wouldn't leave his mind anytime soon. Over the next few days, Mark began to notice that Emma was becoming even more reserved. She avoided leaving her cell phone in sight and was more meticulous about deleting call and message histories. He knew something was up, but he didn't want to face the truth. Perhaps, deep down, he was afraid of discovering that the marriage he valued so much was falling apart before his eyes. One Saturday afternoon, while Emma said she was going to meet a friend for coffee, Mark decided to follow her. He hated what he was doing, he felt like he was invading her privacy, but the need for answers spoke louder. He saw her enter a restaurant downtown, a place they used to frequent together. The pain in her chest grew when she found not her friend, but a man. He looked to be in his 40s, elegant and confident. Emma hugged him with an intimacy that Mark hadn't seen in a long time. Mark watched from a distance as the two laughed and talked. She tried to find justifications in her mind. Maybe he was just a friend from work, someone she needed to meet for professional reasons. But the way she touched his arm, the way the looks they exchanged seemed to last longer than necessary, made reality become inescapable. When they left the restaurant, Mark followed them to a nearby hotel. He stopped the car at a safe distance and stood there, motionless, watching the two enter together. He wanted to believe that he was mistaken, that this was all a huge misunderstanding. But time seemed to drag by as he waited in the car, and his mind couldn't escape the images he had just witnessed. Upon returning home, Mark felt the weight of silence that filled every corner. Emma's betrayal was no longer just a suspicion, but a certainty that he could no longer ignore. He spent the night awake, trying to process what had happened, searching for answers to questions that seemed to have no solution. The next day, Emma returned home as if nothing had happened. The smile she wore, as if she were returning from a casual meeting with a friend, seemed like an affront. Mark watched her in silence, her every gesture now carrying a different meaning. He wanted to confront her right then, but something inside stopped him. He knew that to face this situation, he would need more than an outburst of anger. I would need proof, clarity, a plan. In the days that followed, Mark began to put together his strategy. He reviewed his own habits, his own mistakes, trying to understand if there was anything he could have done to avoid it. At the same time, he began to pay more attention to Emma, to her patterns, to every detail that could confirm what he already knew. One night, while she was sleeping, he took her cell phone. His hands were shaking, not only with fear of what he might find, but also with the guilt of crossing a line he never imagined crossing. The messages he found were enough to eliminate any doubts. Conversations full of intimacy, planned meetings and statements that made your stomach turn. Mark put his cell phone back and left the house for a few minutes, trying to breathe. Emma's betrayal was a fact, and now he needed to decide what he would do with that truth. He could confront her, he could explode with anger, but he knew that would only result in greater chaos. He wanted something more than an impulsive confrontation. I wanted justice, I wanted to regain control of the situation. Emma continued with her routine, unaware that Mark was already aware of everything. He watched her like a stranger, her every smile now seemed filled with falsehood. He wondered how long this had been going on, how many times he had been tricked. But most of all, he wanted to know why. One day, Mark decided it was time to take things a step further. He wrote a letter, not just as a legal document, but as a manifesto of everything he was feeling. Every word carried the pain, anger, and disappointment he had accumulated over the past few months. He knew that when he delivered that letter, there would be no turning back. But I also knew I couldn't continue living with Emma's lies. The following weekend, Emma mentioned an important event she would need to attend. Mark, now with everything planned, decided that this would be the moment. He would go there, face the truth once and for all, and close that chapter of his life. When he arrived at the place, he saw Emma and the man again, together, laughing as if nothing else in the world mattered. He walked towards her, his heart heavy but determined. At the sight of him, Emma froze, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. Mark didn't say anything, just handed the letter to her. She opened the envelope, and when she read the first few lines, her face transformed. The tears began to fall, but Mark remained impassive. He had come this far, and now all he had to do was wait for what would come next. The room seemed smaller than it actually was. Emma was sitting in one of the chairs near the table, holding the letter Mark had handed over, her fingers gripping the paper hard enough to crumple it. She looked at him, but didn't meet his eyes, as if the weight of the silence between them was greater than any words she could say. Mark was standing, motionless, like a statue, with his arms crossed, waiting for her to break that silence that seemed to last an eternity. "Why did you do that?" Mark finally asked, his voice firm but filled with a pain he tried to hide. "I need to hear you say it." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Tears ran down her face as she looked at the man who was once the center of her world. "I don't know," he began, but stopped. She knew that answer wouldn't be enough. "Don't you know?" Mark repeated, now taking a step forward. "Don't you know why you destroyed everything we built? Why did you treat me like an idiot while doing this behind my back?" His voice shook with suppressed anger. Emma looked down at the letter, as if searching for something in it that could help her respond. Finally, with a heavy sigh, she said, "It wasn't supposed to be like this, Mark. I never wanted to hurt you." "Hurt?" He laughed, but the laugh was bitter, almost cynical. "Do you think hurt is a good enough word to describe what you did? You lied. Cheated. He threw away years of trust like they were trash. I was lost." Emma raised her voice, for the first time trying to defend herself. "You don't understand how I've felt these past few years. It was as if I were invisible to you." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "Invisible? I was working, Emma. Fighting every day to give us a better life. To give you everything you ever wanted. But that's not what I needed." Emma countered, now also standing. "I didn't need more stuff, Mark. I needed you. From us. But you were always busy, always distant." Silence once again filled the space between them, but this time it felt even heavier. Mark took a deep breath, trying to control the anger that threatened to explode. He knew he needed to remain calm, but her every word sounded like a flimsy excuse to justify the unjustifiable. "And that's why you decided to run into his arms?" Mark finally asked, her boss's name weighing in the room like a sharp blade. "Because I was working too hard to support the life you said you loved so much?" Emma didn't respond right away. She looked at him, her eyes full of tears and guilt. "It wasn't about him, Mark," he said quietly. "It was about me. About something I lost inside myself." Mark laughed again, but this time there was sadness in his voice. "And you thought you would find yourself betraying the man who was always by your side? Who always believed in you? I know I made a mistake." Emma now seemed to be begging for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe just that he would understand her pain. "But I never wanted to lose you. You already lost me." The words came out of Mark before he could stop himself, and the silence that followed was like a sentence. Emma fell back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Mark watched, but felt no compassion at that moment. All he saw was a woman who had destroyed their lives for something even she didn't seem to understand. He took a few steps to the side, looking out the window. Outside, the world seemed to continue normally, indifferent to the storm that was happening inside that house. He turned to her again, the expression on his face hardened. "But there's something that still doesn't make sense." Emma looked up at him, confused. "What?" "The boss." Mark crossed his arms, staring at her. "Why him? Why someone like him? I want to know what it was there that you found so irresistible." Emma hesitated, her lips trembling as she tried to formulate a response. "He was the one who noticed me first," he said, as if that were justifying anything. "He made me feel alive, wanted. Something I haven't felt in a long time." "Alive?" Mark repeated, incredulity evident in his voice. "Did you need another man to feel alive? And you didn't bother to think about what that would do to me? With our lives?" "I wasn't thinking clearly." Emma shouted, now also filled with frustration. "I was lost, Mark. And he was there. He was there because he wanted to use you." Mark shouted back, anger finally exploding. "Do you think he cared about you? He only cared about what you could give him, and now you threw away everything we had because of it. Emma began to cry more intensely, Mark's words piercing like knives. He, however, did not back down. He needed to say what was in his heart before it was too late. I trusted you, Emma. I gave you my all, and you chose to betray that. Not just with me, but with someone who clearly wasn't worth it. So now, tell me, what did you expect to happen? That I would never find out? That I could just move on as if nothing had happened? I just want things to go back to the way they were before, Emma said between sobs. But I was wrong, Mark. I know I made a mistake. Mark looked at her for long seconds, his eyes filled with a pain she had never seen before. Finally, he took a step back, as if he needed to get away from her to catch his breath. You made a mistake, yes, he said, his voice now lower, but still full of emotion. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you for that. Emma tried to get up, but Mark raised his hand as a signal for her to stop. I need some time, he said, before leaving the room and leaving her alone with the weight of her choices. Outside, Mark took a deep breath, feeling the cold night air fill his lungs. He knew that conversation was just the beginning of something much bigger, something he still needed to face. And although part of him wanted to go back, look at her and try to understand, another part knew that what came next would be even more devastating. The secret he suspected was behind all this was still hidden, waiting to be revealed. And he was ready to find out, no matter the cost. Mark walked aimlessly through the streets as Emma's words echoed in his mind. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if carrying the weight of all the pain and disappointment that had accumulated in his chest. The night was silent, but within him there was a storm. He couldn't erase the image of her crying in the living room, her eyes begging for something he could no longer give, trust. As he walked, Mark tried to organize his thoughts. Emma's betrayal had opened up wounds he didn't even know existed. It wasn't just about the act itself, but about everything it symbolized. He felt that every moment he spent with her had been tainted. The laughs, the plans, even the most intimate moments, now seemed like part of a story he no longer recognized. He sat on a park bench, watching the dim streetlights. The cool night air helped clear his mind, but it also made it harder to ignore reality. Mark knew he needed to make a decision, but each possibility seemed worse than the last. Forgiving Emma would mean living with the weight of what she had done. Moving forward, on the other hand, felt like an insurmountable mountain. He still loved her. That was undeniable, but love, at that moment, felt like a prison. Back at the house, Emma was sitting in the same chair, unable to move. The silence in the room was deafening, and Mark's absence made every second seem like an eternity. She relived the conversation over and over, searching for the words she could have said to change the course of that night. But nothing seemed enough. Guilt consumed her overwhelmingly, as if every breath was a reminder of her choices. Emma knew she had crossed a line she could not come back from. She thought about all the times Mark had been by her side, the sacrifices he had made, and she couldn't understand how she had allowed her life to get to this point. But now, more than ever, she needed to be honest, even if it meant losing everything. When Mark finally returned home, the clock said it was almost midnight. He entered the door with slow steps, his shoulders slumped, as if the very force of his presence in that space demanded more of him than he could bear. Emma saw him and instinctively stood up, but hesitated, not knowing whether to approach. Do you still have anything else to tell me? Mark asked, his voice low but firm. He didn't look at her directly, fixing his eyes on a random spot on the wall. Emma took a deep breath, knowing that this moment was crucial. Yes, he replied, without hesitation. I need to tell you everything. Mark finally looked at her, but his face was void of any emotion. Then tell it. She hesitated for a moment, but knew she could no longer retreat. It wasn't just about me or how I felt. It was, him. He knew exactly what he was doing, Mark. From the beginning, he manipulated me. Mark frowned. Manipulated? Do you want to make me believe you had no choice? I'm not saying it wasn't my fault. He was. But you don't understand how he acts. He does this with everyone. I saw other women going through the same cycle. He reaches out, finds our vulnerabilities, and uses it against us. I was weak, I allowed it, but he knew exactly how to make me fall. Mark shook his head in disbelief. And what should that make me feel? Pity? Understanding? You still chose to cheat, Emma. You chose that, regardless of what he did or said. I know. Emma began to cry again, but this time there was something else in her tears, a mix of desperation and urgency. But that's not all. He threatens. He uses what he knows to maintain control. I got stuck in it out of fear, Mark. Afraid of what? Mark asked, frustration evident. What could he do? Emma hesitated before answering, her hands shaking as she tried to find the right words. He knows about us. About our life, our secrets. He has information that could destroy more than just our marriage. Mark felt his heart speed up. He was still processing the betrayal, but now he felt something bigger was at stake. What kind of information, Emma? What are you talking about? Emma looked away, unable to look at him. He used my confidence against me. He knew about our financial past, about the times we struggled to make ends meet. And he threatened to expose it, to ruin you, your career. I didn't know how to get out of it. Mark took a deep breath, trying to absorb what she was saying. The anger and hurt were still there, but now something else was emerging, a sense of alertness. He didn't know how true Emma's words were, but the fact that she was willing to reveal it meant that the problem was bigger than he imagined. And you thought the best solution was to continue with this? Mark asked, his voice now more controlled but still filled with frustration. Did you think hiding it from me was the best way to deal with this? I was scared, Emma admitted. Scared of losing you, afraid of what he could do. I know it sounds selfish, but I didn't know how to tell you. Mark ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. He felt like he was being pulled in opposite directions. The hurt made him want to walk away from Emma forever, but the revelation about her boss left him with a new dilemma. He knew he needed to make a decision, but each option seemed worse than the other. I need to think, Mark said, turning to leave again. Mark, please don't go. Emma tried to hold him back, but he backed away. I can't stay here now, Emma. I need space. I need to understand what I'm going to do with all of this. He left again, leaving Emma alone in the silence. As he walked through the cold night, Mark knew he was faced with an impossible choice. He had discovered the betrayal, but now he knew there was something darker behind it all. And although part of him wanted to just leave it all behind, another part knew he needed to confront this new truth before deciding what to actually do. Mark stopped in the same square where he had been before, feeling the weight of what was to come. He knew he needed to act, but the question that echoed in his mind was, how to face an enemy who already knew so much about his life. And how to deal with the fact that the person he trusted most was the one who opened the doors for this to happen. Mark didn't come home that night. He walked around the city, thinking about everything he had discovered and the weight of the decisions he needed to make. Every street, every corner seemed to bring back a memory of his life with Emma, moments that now seemed distant and unreal, as if they belonged to someone else. The cold early morning air was a relief from the heat of his anger, but it didn't erase the deep pain that throbbed in his chest. In the morning, he went to a lawyer's office. It wasn't an easy decision, but he knew he needed help to face what was coming. It exposed everything, the betrayal, the threats, and the manipulative behavior of Emma's boss. The lawyer listened carefully and promised to help him protect his interests. Mark felt a small sense of relief, as if, for the first time in weeks, he had some control over the situation. Meanwhile, Emma remained at home, surrounded by overwhelming silence. Every minute without hearing from Mark felt like an eternity. She knew he needed time, but she feared that time would only push him further away. Despite this, he began to write a letter. I didn't know if he would read it, but I needed to put into words everything I felt, regret, guilt, and the love I still had for him. Across town, Emma's boss, Robert, remained oblivious to the storm he had caused. To him, Emma was just another name in a long list of women he had manipulated and discarded. He didn't care about the consequences. I had never had to deal with them before. But this time, there was something different. Mark wasn't the kind of man who accepted being manipulated. Mark spent the next few days gathering evidence. He revisited messages, emails, and everything that could link Robert to the manipulation scheme. With the help of his lawyer, he came up with a strategy that would not only expose Robert's actions, but also protect Emma from possible retaliation. Despite everything, he still wanted to make sure she wasn't completely destroyed by his choices. When the day of the final confrontation arrived, Mark arranged a meeting with Emma. He invited her to a discreet cafe, away from prying eyes. Emma arrived with her eyes swollen from crying, but there was a determination in her posture that Mark hadn't seen in a long time. He looked at her in silence for a few seconds before starting. "Emma, I've made a decision," he said, his voice firm. "I don't know if I can forgive what you did. But I also don't want it to define the rest of our lives." Emma swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "I would do anything to make this right, Mark. Anything." "Then you will help me take down Robert," he replied, looking straight into her eyes. She was silent for a few moments, processing what he had said. Finally, he nodded. "Whatever you need me to do, I'll do it." With Emma's help, Mark was able to put together a complete dossier on Robert's activities. The evidence was irrefutable: threatening messages, suspicious financial transfers and statements from other victims that Mark managed to track down. He knew that facing Robert would be dangerous, but he was determined to end the cycle of manipulation that had destroyed so many lives. On the day everything came to light, Mark and Emma, accompanied by their lawyer, handed the evidence over to the authorities. The investigation was quick, and Robert was confronted in his own company. The look of shock on his face when he was arrested was something Mark would never forget. For the first time, the man who thought he was untouchable was forced to face the consequences of his actions. But for Mark and Emma, the real battle was yet to come. Despite working together to expose Robert, their relationship was far from mended. Emma knew that Mark's forgiveness wouldn't come easily, and Mark knew it would take time to rebuild the trust that had been destroyed. A few weeks later, Mark finally read the letter Emma had written. Her words were sincere, full of regret and reflections on the mistakes she had made. He knew he still loved her, but he also knew that love alone wouldn't be enough to overcome everything that had happened. They decided to separate, at least for a while, so they could both process what had happened and find a way to move forward, whether together or apart. Robert, in turn, faced a public trial that exposed his abusive practices. He lost the position of power he valued so much and was condemned to pay for his crimes. The victims he had manipulated finally found justice, and Mark felt like he had somehow contributed to something bigger. Months later, Mark began to rebuild his life. He rediscovered passions he had set aside, reconnected with old friends, and eventually began to open himself up to new possibilities. Emma, on the other hand, also began her journey of self-discovery. She began attending therapy, determined to understand the choices that led her to that point and to become a better person. Their fate remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: they both learned profound lessons about trust, love, and the impact of the choices we make. The pain of betrayal left marks that would never be erased, but it also opened space for growth and change. And so, Mark and Emma's story ended, not as a fairy tale, but as a reflection on the complexity of human relationships and the consequences of our actions. Now, we want to know, what did you think of this story? What is your opinion on the characters' decisions? If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your comment. Here, we believe that betrayal is never the way to go, and our stories are created to show the devastating impact it can have. Until the next story.